Robert, yeah. He is an expert and ecologist and like he knows the plants management of the landscape. He knows, so he's very knowledgeable. He came to us a few months ago from New England Botanical Gardens, from years of experience, doing amazing work there. And you have to check his website. He has a lot of like seminars and programs. He not only is knowledgeable, but he loves sharing what he knows with people. So I think it's a beautiful opportunity, and I'm really grateful that you took part of your Saturday to be here and do this for us. So please help me to welcome our Robert.
Well, that was quite an introduction. Thank you. So we're going to be talking about habitat management and invasive species that we're doing here at Norcross. I'm going to touch on habitat management in general, but really focusing on invasive species because as I kind of come into this role, that's one of the main things I'll be picking up. And before I start rolling, I would love to ask what everybody's interested in learning more about specifically. Nothing.
I'll bet.
Yes.
So I have land in Union and I'm trying to remove the invasives and I've done lots of different things and I need to find out why they keep coming back.
Yes.
What am I supposed to be doing next?
Awesome. We will.
Is that natural or, you know?
Wow. That is part of the problem with invasive. We'll talk about that for sure. Lois.
What are my battles? Which ones should I worry about the most?
There's a lot of them. We'll talk about that too. So one of the most important things when we're talking about invasive species, it's not getting overwhelmed, prioritizing projects. To put it in perspective, we have 8,000 acres here and it's just me. So a lot of prioritizing and picking our battles as far as what we're doing. So a little bit more about me. So I've been here for only 5 months now, I think, after 10 years in horticulture, landscape construction, ecology, at New England Botanic Garden. One of my specialties is meadows and meadow restoration, early successional habitat. Some of the large scale forest restoration we're doing here and river restoration is a little bit newer to me, but it's something I'd been diving into a lot at the garden. So I'm excited to be kind of diving headfirst into it here. And a little bit about Norcross, if you don't know, core of our work, we have 8,352 acres of land we own and steward in South Central Massachusetts, Northern Connecticut. That includes a block of around close to 5,000 contiguous acres. So when it comes to managing habitat, that's one of the most important things is restoring connectivity for species to be able to travel in between protected lands. Of course, it's always great to conserve land as much as possible, but the important thing is having it connected. So one of the things Norcross is working on is having a large corridor for wildlife to move up and down across Massachusetts and into Connecticut. And luckily for me, all of our habitat looks just like this, completely perfect. There is no, never mind. So we have a lot of habitat that looks like this and is in great shape and is stuff that I'm not super worried about. We also have a lot of this. Anybody familiar with this species if you're from around here?
Is it burning?
Close.
Barberry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's something that's been new to me here. Central Massachusetts, burning bush around all those gardens is something I had massively problematic in a lot of my natural areas. For whatever reason, out here in Western Massachusetts, Japanese barberry is brutal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is for me when we're talking about some of our habitats, looking at areas like this and how I don't immediately tender my resignation as I start working here. So there's a lot that looks like this. So I'll talk about it in the context of the project that I'm jumping into right away, kind of one of the biggest ones we're working on right now, which is the Vinica Brook restoration. So there's going to be some massive changes at Norcross. We have Vinica Brook that travels through most of the core of the property. If you look here, this kind of explains some of those parcels. So this section right here in the middle is the Tupper Core parcel. And then all those other polygons are other parcels that we own that are kind of connected to that main block. And Vinica Brook kind of runs down and loops through the property and up and out.
So that's all one.
This parcel right here. Yep.
The brook.
Right.
Okay.
So Vinica Brook runs all the way down from up here, kind of comes through the property, through Vinica Pond, up through all of the Arthur Norcross historic ponds, and out of the property and goes towards Covenant Dam, the Army Corps property down the road. Conant, thank you. Sorry. New to the area. I'm from right south of Worcester, so it's been a whole, even just getting around to all our properties, I get lost pretty often. So but with that restoration, there's going to be some major changes. There's going to be some dams being drained. The natural stream flow is going to be returning. And what that's going to do is going to leave bare exposed sediment. And it's going to make it really easy for those invasive species that are really disturbance adapted to immediately jump into those. So a lot of these different pretty colors, the red, green, and blue, is me going out and walking every section of Vinica Brook that we are responsible for and figuring out how much I'm going to have to deal with. And when you look at our properties, that is such a tiny part, but this is hundreds of acres right here of just areas that we need to jump in and manage. So there's a lot that we have here, and I'm going to kind of go over invasive species identification, what we're doing here at Norcross, and how I look at something like this that I've gone out and field truth and come up with a plan on how to tackle it without either overwhelming resources or freaking out and quitting my job. Absolutely.
You said with draining them, it's going to leave the sediment. And what did you say that's going to do with the invasives?
So a lot of invasives are what we call disturbance adapted. So the reason they're really prolific is they do a really good job at growing before anything else in areas where there's heavy disturbance. So soil turned up, whether you're digging a hole, you're putting in a road, exposing bare soil. So,
That's where they come.
yep.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot of factors that come with that. Disturbance doesn't necessarily mean invasive species. It usually means if there's a presence of invasives near there, they can easily populate. But you have areas where you can have disturbance, and if there is no history of invasives, they won't necessarily be there. It really depends on site history if they were ever there in the first place.
So it doesn't make you worry more that they would come into that area. That's why I asked you,
Yeah.
because it sounded backwards to me.
So we do worry with it because what I'm mapping here,
Yeah,
so we're going to be exposing this soil,
yeah.
but unfortunately in all these tributaries like Schoolhouse Brook and a lot of these sections of Vinica, just upstream, we have invasives. So downstream, we're going to be exposing soil, and those invasives upstream can just jump right in the river and then go right up to that exposed soil. So that's what I'm focusing on and worried about, is in those areas specifically. So before we even dive too much into invasive, I'm going to kind of define it because I think a lot of people get confused as to what it is. So the definition from the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group is invasive plants are non-native species that have spread into native or minimally managed plant systems in Massachusetts. These plants cause economic and environmental harm by developing self-sustaining populations and becoming dominant and or disruptive to those systems. As defined here, species include all synonyms, subspecies, varieties, forms, and cultivars of that species unless proven otherwise by a process of scientific evaluation. That's too complicated, so I'm going to explain it a little different. So there's a lot of terms you'll hear thrown around when we're talking about invasive species management. One of the ones you hear a lot is naturalized. Naturalized, in my definition, is a self-sustaining population of specifically non-native plants. These can be invasive, but many times they don't fall under the criteria that is defined as invasive. Some good examples, ones that you see all the time: red clover, white clover, Queen Anne's lace, climbing spindle tree, the euonymus. You see them really prevalent, and if you didn't know that they weren't native from here, you would just assume they're a native plant. But native, we're talking about things that grew in this region historically since glaciation. Another term you hear a lot is noxious. That specific term just means whatever species it is, native or not, is harmful to agricultural or horticultural crops. So me kind of taking that and simplifying it is invasive plants are aggressive non-native plants that displace native species through increased competition for resources. So
some of that was what Norcross was into, because we used to go up to Maine and dig up plants on the side of the road that weren't, and bring them back here to try to make them live.
Yep. And many species that don't fall under that criteria of invasive, as defined by the state, are still worth managing depending on the project to promote the native species in those areas.
And
when you said noxious.
Yes.
That's only for horticultural or agricultural reasons, not if it damages the habitat of the native wildlife.
Yep, so that's just invasive. It's really noxious is just a terminology that's used by those departments specifically for those causes. A lot of that, all those things I just talked about are different terminology for words that kind of get confused a lot of times for people that don't understand what each one is. But we're going to stop specifically talk about invasive species. So one of the hardest things I think people run into is knowing what plants are invasive or not. Something like that Japanese barberry, I don't think you need to assume you can look at that and be like, I feel like this shouldn't be the only thing I see for the next 20 acres, right? So the first step in being able to manage any invasive species is being able to identify it in the first place. Easy way to think about it, if a plant is showing aggressive tendencies in the garden, warrants some identification and management. If you are a book person like me, even though I'm from the not book generation, my go-to book resource is this book, Eradicate Invasive Plants by Terry Dunchance. This is a fantastic book. I will say she does put some plants that I wouldn't label as invasive in there because they're native plants, but I understand it. She talks about specific mechanical management techniques, talks about different chemical techniques, timing, and easy ways to kind of plan it. Once you've identified plants, it's a great resource to go to. Another thing a lot of people use that, like I said, are book people are field guides, but unfortunately, a lot of the local field guides aren't going to help you with invasive plants. Sometimes if something's super common like Queen Anne's lace or red clover, maybe it'll show up in here because it's common, but they're really not going to show you the invasive plants in books like that. I would say the best way to go about identifying plants nowadays is actually some of the technology we have available, like iNaturalist. There's lots of different, you could call them AI, you could call them different types of recognition programs for your phone, for the computer, that will help you identify plants. But I would argue that iNaturalist and PlantNet, two pretty common ones, are some of the best. What a lot of people I hear use are things like their iPhone, Find This, and everything. The problem with that is it's just throwing it into a computer program and trying to decide what that plant looks like. Whereas something like iNaturalist, you're posting the picture, it'll give you some suggestions on what that plant might be, but then a scientist or another individual will come in later and confirm your identification. So I use this super heavily on the property, both for when we're looking at native plants that me and the other botanists here don't recognize, but also for invasive plants that we just need confirmed identification. This picture up here is an example of a project I started where we're actually across all of our parcels, anytime anybody on staff or anybody that comes and visits finds and identifies a native plant, I can go in there, can confirm that identification and basically know where everything is when I'm thinking about my management plan. What's great about using something like this, not only are you beginning to learn those plants, you're also contributing to projects that people like me, people like Mass Auto, and other organizations that are using similar techniques can manage, because there's only so much time we can actually spend out in the field and find where everything is. This is a great interaction that I had a couple years ago that I think kind of highlights why this tool is so helpful. Is anybody familiar with Persian silk tree? Not one I see out here as often. You go further east, you go further south, it's something you start to see more often. It's this really pretty pink flower, but it's not something we see very often. There are people that have planted in their gardens that sometimes does well. It's one of those ones that we would call borderline. It never used to really grow here because it would die because it was too cold for it here. But as it starts to get a little bit warmer some seasons, it can start to grow and spread. I posted this picture in a parking lot. So sometimes we'll see trees spread directly. Say you have a planted horticultural specimen, you have it grow seedlings underneath it. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as calling that invasive, but when you see it start to leave wherever it grew from and show up miles and miles away, that's when we start to have a problem. So I had posted this plant and somebody had commented, that one doesn't even show up in Massachusetts. And I said, yeah, it's not supposed to, but here it is. And I've been seeing it more and more. So it's another way that researchers can keep track of things that are becoming new problems that weren't necessarily ever problems before. One that I like to talk about a lot, from especially when I was in the horticulture industry, one that us in the horticulture industry have noticed but haven't necessarily kind of rung the bell on, is Japanese maple, which is a very, very popular tree. the last 5 years, we went from maybe seeing a seedling or two to I have gardeners that were pulling out 500, 600, 1,000 seedlings from the Japanese maples on the property.
Rose of Sharon's like that.
Rose of Sharon's another good one. There's a long list that the horticulture industry has a little inside knowledge on. It's stuff like that that we're trying to keep track of. And a lot of us talk about something like burning bush being, had we thought about that 30 years ago, maybe we could have controlled it before it started to spread. Whereas we're just now saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't plant this because there's no woods that doesn't have it. So when it comes to like just a bulk list of that definition of invasive plants for Massachusetts specifically, Connecticut has a very similar list. This is kind of the organization that everybody defers to, which is the Massachusetts Invasive Plants Advisory Group. It's a great group of different botanists and scientists across the region that basically come together and say, hey, what are the trends for different species we have coming up? And they basically categorize them into these different categories as invasive, likely, potentially, or currently not meeting criteria. So this list right here for invasive, there's some pretty similar ones that many people probably recognize: tree of heaven, garlic mustard, Norway maple, which I don't see as much out here, but when you get closer to the city, especially in central Mass and further east, it's the only thing you see. This is who we defer to for that specific term, invasive. It's not who I only defer to when I'm thinking about stuff, because managing all that acreage, I'm trying to jump on things before they get to this point. Stuff that's on the invasive list is already a known problem and something that's going to be difficult to manage. Another great resource is this website from Native Plant Trust Botany. This is the digital form of Flora Nova Angliae. It is basically all of the plants in the region in the Northeast. It talks about where they were originally discovered, if they're invasive. These different colors on the side here show that they're a non-native plant and they're found across these different counties. It's basically comparing historical records of whether a plant is native or naturalized to that area. It's a great resource where you can go in, especially if you use something like iNaturalist and you can get down to the family it's in. You can go check that family in here and scan through our native ones versus our non-native ones. So something like iris here is an interesting one. So Iris eucarpus is this super invasive iris, but we do have a native iris that can look very similar if you're new. So going in here and comparing the pictures and the ranges is something you can use once you get to that point. This is another, I'm going to keep throwing tools at you. It's going to be a lot. Don't worry. We'll share the presentation too, so you can look it all up later. But this is another tool I use all the time, Biota of North America. It's very similar to GoBotany, except this is on a national audience, right? So in something like this, I can look at something like this one here, Hedera, which is English ivies. So Hedera helix is English ivy, or it is the true ivies. So Hedera helix is in English ivy, and this color key that you have here shows you different feature types, very similar to GoBotany, where we have that noxious weed category, we have the exotic category, so not native, noxious. They don't classify invasive because it's a national, and that's on the state level whether they're going to classify it or not, but they can tell you whether it's from here or not. So on this map, you can see that all that blue means Hedera helix, English ivy, is in all of those areas across the country. What this map is saying is it's only noxious up here in the Pacific Northwest. It's a problem here, but it doesn't fall under invasive in Massachusetts by this definition or by the state's definition. Another tool, because there's a whole bunch of them, is this one, EdMaps. This one's a little, I would put this more on the researcher side. This is very similar to iNaturalist, but this is what us as scientists use. This is verified, not just iNaturalist is verified by other community members. It's what we would call community science. So people are going in there and basically comparing notes. Somebody's more knowledgeable than the other, they can help you out. Whereas these maps are only done by scientists that are researching those topics. So say I post something like spotted lanternfly, that won't show up as an observation on that map until an entomologist comes in and verifies that observation and adds it to the map. It works very similar. You can use it just like iNaturalist, but it's a little kind of next level of your confirmation on what that species is. this is a tool I use for stuff that is something we don't see very often. So if I have something that I know is not known in this region that shows up, I'm going to throw it on here versus iNaturalist because it's going to be a surprise to scientists. They want to keep track of some of those novel changes. I was using this a lot when I was in the horticulture industry because we would get invasives that weren't necessarily common, say at a place like Norcross, where there isn't a ton of new plants coming in. Whereas in the horticulture industry, I'm planting anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 plants that any one of those could have something in the soil that we weren't expecting. So a tool like this is super helpful for that. And the state is on this very quickly. And every time I would post something, I'd be getting a phone call like, what nursery did that come from? So we could try to stop some of those problems before they started. So I got a bunch of pictures where I'm just going to throw some of the ones that I think are pretty common. And we kind of see everywhere. So I'm sure people are familiar with this one. I used to talk about for a long time when I first started out in the industry working in ecology, I also was a landscaper. And I used to talk about my two alter egos where I'd go to work at my first job and be eliminating burning bush. And then I'd go to my second job and be pruning them very artfully because we had this disconnect where the horticulture industry was still using it because people wanted it. And then the ecology industry was like, oh my God, this is so problematic. We have to manage it. So we were kind of on that threshold. And this one's pretty easy to see if you're out in the woods. A lot of times people get this confused with blueberry. Leaves look kind of similar, the shape, the color. Blueberry is a great alternative, like high bush blueberry, if you wanted to plant a native plant that looks like this. The easiest way to distinguish, though, is that stem with those wings. So another name for it is winged euonymus. Rose multiflora, great plant, beautiful, smells great. Introduced in the horticulture trade, which you're going to hear a lot. This is another one that's problematic out here. You see it in small edges of fields. It kind of shows up everywhere. Those rose hips are really small compared to a lot of our native ones, so they move really readily. And a thing that people don't think about is the size, because a lot of times you see them in your fields and they're kind of what they are. I've seen it get up to 20 feet tall because it can run right up trees. And there'll be some pictures of some of my projects I've worked on later where I was ripping out multiflora rose that was 2-3 stories tall, just because when it's in the right area, it can kind of blow up. But unfortunately, it is really pretty and smells really nice. My parents still at home have one that they refuse to let me get rid of because they swear they planted it. I said, I don't think so, but that's okay. We won't hurt you. They know what my job is. This one's pretty common, bittersweet. I would argue that bittersweet is probably the most prevalent and problematic invasive species we have in Massachusetts and in the Northeast. What's kind of interesting about this one is nobody across the country talks about this. It's present, but it's not a problem like it is up here. For whatever reason, we have it really bad. And a lot of other parts of the country, it's just not as problematic for them. But they have their own things that are more problematic. Go down to the South and Midwest. We don't have kudzu. Well, we could talk about that too, but kudzu is very quickly making its way up. We're into Connecticut, past New York, and climbing up the highway to get to here. If you go down the Met going down to New York, you can see it making its way up here pretty quick. So, but another one, this is going to be a trend. This one passed out in the 50s, great bird seed. Yep. So, most of these invasives got here through not accident. Usually they're purposeful introductions. Garlic mustard, this one you see everywhere. What's interesting about this one is this is one of our herbaceous invasives. So it's a biennial. This is one that I would say is very easy for a homeowner to manage, pending timing and commitment. So biennial meaning it only comes up every 2 years. If you can interrupt that cycle, it's actually pretty easy to manage. But it's everywhere. And even if you pull the plant out and throw it on the ground, it can still produce seeds on the ground ripped out. It doesn't care. It's invincible. Unless you get it at the right timing. Here's one that is, when we talk about Vinegar Brook restoration, this is the most problematic one that I have right now that we need to manage with this restoration. This is all over the banks of Vinegar Brook. easily spread by birds. It's got these delicious fruit. And once it establishes, it can be really difficult. Cutting it won't do anything other than increase its vigor, make it grow more stems, and make it harder to manage. And then timing it, it can just be really difficult to manage. But that's something you're going to see. It's called glossy buckthorn because the foliage itself is very shiny. It has these big dark fruit. It can look like some of our native plants. I would argue it could look like some of our native choke cherries. But usually you're going to see it in these dense populations. And this one is really hard to get a hold of once it starts to get away. Purple loosestrife. I've been seeing it quite a bit more on my way into here through pretty much every ditch in Wales. This one's kind of interesting. This one is from Europe. It is not, it's not a wetland obligate, meaning it doesn't only grow in wetlands, but it's one that we see pretty often in wetlands because it can grow there. It's just really good at displacing the native wetland plants that are in there. Again, harder to manage. It's an herbaceous plant. It doesn't take much root left behind for it to be there. This is one of the ones in the United States where biocontrol, which is kind of a controversial topic of basically introducing another thing to get rid of that thing. There was a project through the USDA where they introduced this beetle called the Galloricella beetle here to eliminate purple loosestrife, and then eventually when it ran out of food, it would eliminate itself. Biocontrol is the best way to manage invasive species. But the problem is the amount of time it takes to do the research to verify that it's not going to harm native species is so long. For something like Galloricella, it was over 10 years of research. And then once it gets released, who knows what they missed? It could end up being another problem. When I talk about this kind of thing, I like to talk about Florida. I've been there twice. It's too hot. But down there, they have all these cichlid species, all these fish species. The solution to get rid of the cichlids, which are from South America, was to introduce peacock bass. Now they just have both of them, so it didn't really solve the problem. That's kind of similar to a lot of those. Some of those early biocontrols kind of failed in that way, and so when we talk about new ones, it can be very difficult, especially when we're talking about things like viruses, diseases, instead of necessarily individuals. It can be a little controversial, but if it was done right, that would be the best way to manage them, because a lot of times you're talking about viruses that adapted with them out in their native climate and bringing them over here to manage them here. But it's not something you're going to hear about a lot. And when it is, it's going to be receiving a lot of opposition. But hopefully we get to a point where we can have a way to introduce things on the landscape to get rid of the invasive plants that doesn't affect our native species. Here's the one we talked about earlier, Japanese barberry. One of the biggest problems with this one is it basically means you're going to have really good habitat for things like rabbits, mice, things that are going to be bringing ticks. A lot of people think white-tailed deer are the main increases in white-tailed deer numbers are the main increase in tick. A lot of times it's actually more from white-footed mouse than it is going to be from deer. So managing managing Japanese barberry is going to manage tick populations on your property, getting a hold of it. So for instance, that picture that we looked at earlier is one of our properties called Hovey Road. You are guaranteed to get covered in ticks if you go there because it's super protected habitat. There's no predators that can go in there and manage. And so the ticks just take a ride in and just hang out there. And we have a lot of that on this property. And I think that's a big factor that contributes to how many ticks we have here. Here's another common one. Again, the most problematic ones in my mind are the herbaceous invasives. So mugwort, artemisia, looks very similar to our native ragweed. Same family. Ragweed is an annual, mugwort is perennial. This is one that came in as part of kind of the medicinal root is what I would call it. This is one of the ones that ended up being invasive. There's a lot of other plants that came in all the way back from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s that came in those herbal gardens that are either naturalized or invasive now. This one is really hard to manage when it gets out of hand, can really take over a lot of roadside edges. You're going to see this if you were to look down Munson Wales Road where you came in, all that new soil they brought in that was sitting at a site somewhere is full of seeds like this. And unfortunately, that's a problem that's the main way a lot of these invasive species get around is through contaminated soil. That's not anybody's fault to say, but it's really hard to keep. When you have to do construction projects like that, it's really hard to keep that soil from getting contaminated. So I like to talk about it because it's something we should be thinking about it, but we're not going to blame the DPW because of the work they're doing. Same thing. A lot of invasive spread. If you drive all around the road, Japanese knotweed is another common one we'll talk about in a second. That salt sand mix has Japanese knotweed in it. They got to put it down on the road. It's going to be on the roadside. So it's one of those things that's just really hard to kind of contain when it gets to the point that it's at. So this is another new one. This is on the invasive species list now. This is one that we most definitely had planted at the garden. We would call this one escaped cultivation is how this started. So this was a cultivated plant. It was grown, and then it started to just leave. So another one that isn't on the invasive list that I could talk about that maybe some of you have seen is something like vinca. Vinca is a common garden plant, but it can run right out of your garden out into the woods. So this is kind of that class of invasives that, again, spread from horticulture, which is trendy. This is a new one to the region. This one is what we would call the likely invasive list. This one is all over that roadside construction and a lot of the other construction projects I've worked on, it's been on. It's kind of a new one. This one has me really worried. This is a good one to pay attention to and learn. So this is Japanese hops. It is the same family as the one that makes all the super delicious drinks. But unfortunately, the fruit on this is a little small. It's got a tiny, tiny little hop. But it's one that's showing up a lot. Construction soil. Every construction project I worked on in New England Botanic Garden, this was something that I immediately had to handle. Because every time we did something, I would find this in the soil that came in. And it's really just kind of ringing bells right now at the state. I'm sure this one will make the invasive species list by, if not this year, the next few years, because it's starting to be really problematic. And it grows kind of similar to bittersweet, where you have this big vine structure.
I was gonna ask if
Yeah.
it was viney. Yeah.
Yep, super
Yeah.
viney. And it spreads pretty easily from its seed. So it's a very airy, light seed. Here's another one that this one is one of those species that's not invasive. So this is under that term naturalized. I don't necessarily agree with that classification because it can be problematic. This one's tansy. Looks very, very similar to our goldenrods, another medicinal plant that came in the 1700s. So this one, when we talk about naturalized versus invasive, a lot of times what that term means is somebody has determined that that plant is not native, is all over that environment, but we've deemed it not to be a problem. It is not causing ecological harm. It is not competing with native plants. For this one specifically, in the right context, I would disagree with that. Some of the meadow projects I've worked on, this can be really problematic. But as of right now, it falls under that classification of naturalized. So it's good to know both of them. Because depending on your specific instance, there might be a time where some of these naturalized species, if your goal is ecological health, removing them is going to be important. And that even qualifies for things like clover at certain times, which we'll talk about later. So there's another new group that we're working with here at Norcross. It's a group that I've worked with since it first started back in 2021. A lot of the people who were working in invasive species at a lot of these botanic gardens across the country said, hey, we should probably be paying attention to some of these problems, because it came from conversations like that. We would have these annual conferences where all of us traveled from all over the country, and somebody would be like, hey, has Japanese maple been a problem for you guys? And we're like, oh my God, we pulled out 1,000 this year. So we decided to have a group where we go in and actually report some of these things that nobody's talking about in the nursery trade, nobody's talking about at the state as far as like ecological health impacts. This is as early detection gets when we talk about non-native plants starting to spread. The first one that we reported with this tool back in 2024 was Amur cork tree, one that's not super common up here. Norcross has a couple invasions of it. You go out towards Fitchburg, you go out towards Natick, it's everywhere. It's not something that's common, but when it's near cultivated spaces, it's starting to escape quite a bit. So we're kind of ringing the bells on some of these things that we've been planting for the last 50 years that are now, with the way the temperatures have been changing. Some of our winters haven't been as harsh. Some of these species are able to make it through where they weren't before. And another great way to get involved. So projects like that are great. iNaturalist is the best way for anybody in the community to be making meaningful impact about the spread of invasive species. There's all these projects like this one, Invasive Flora of Massachusetts, where every observation of an invasive species in Massachusetts shows up on this list. And scientists can go in and say, oh, okay, we have a massive population of tree of heaven that's showing up outside of the city in this meadow that maybe we should be thinking about. So I definitely think you should take advantage of that tool. It's a great way to learn. By the time you've gone and done 10 observations, even if you didn't know a plant, you're going to start to notice some trends, and that's a great way to learn it without going through the super intense botanical keys that make it too complicated sometimes if you don't know the terminology. So because I've only been here 5 months, I don't have a ton of massive projects we've worked on here. So I'm going to talk about some of my projects I was working on at New England Botanic Garden. So at New England Botanic Garden, a little smaller than here, I was responsible for 200 acres, which felt like a lot. Not anymore. One of the things that we had there was massive growth, massive construction. So a lot of my job as the one ecologist on staff was managing some of this new construction and habitat. So like I said, I'm a meadow specialist. I specialize in early successional habitat, which is kind of that first stage. So you cut the whole forest down, all the herbaceous plants come up. That's your meadow habitat. That's what I'm good at. So this project specifically, we have a 10-acre parking lot disturbance that I turned into what I would argue is a pretty successful meadow. And this is what it looked like at the start. So 2021, this new parking lot got put in, and this is literally just fill that they bulldozed from that parking lot. And said, here you go. It's going to be a beautiful meadow someday. And I said, okay. And so 2021, they bulldoze that pile, they throw some seed on it and say, thank you for the money and leave. And it's on me for that whole 10 acres. So I was a little scared because this is what it looked like in 2023. Now, that doesn't look like a very lush meadow. We start to see some of the species that I was talking about, like clover. Some of those invasives aren't super obvious in here, but we're starting to get some of those disturbance-based invasives showing up in this pile. And the way I think a lot of homeowners where they are dealing with invasives are in their yard. They're trying to make a meadow. They're trying to make a field edge. This is kind of going to be in the same kind of vein, doing restoration like this. So this is what it looks like in 2023, and it was not looking great. So 2 years after seeding, this is what I've got. But there's some very specific timing of invasive management, which we'll talk. Yeah, go ahead.
What did you hydro seed with?
So it was a native seed mix, which can also be problematic. This was from a company called New England Wetland Plants.
Oh,
But
they're in Hadley.
yep, the mix itself though is actually from Ernst, so they kind of buy it and then redistribute it. But either way, so it's a native seed mix. This mix was called a conservation mix. But if we ever do a meadow talk here, I'll talk a lot about seed because that's a whole another layer of complicated. But this is a native seed mix, primarily focused on grasses.
Okay.
So this was going to be a grassland meadow.
Do they
So
water it at all?
did not get any water.
That's a big problem.
That's a big space to not have any water. So when it comes to areas like that on this scale, so there's another way we're going to talk about scale when we're talking about managing invasives. There's only so much I can do. I can't go out and water. Pretty much the only thing I have is mowing. So the only thing I did in this meadow, as we're going to look at the next 5 years, is mow at very, very specific times. So 2023, this is a little bit later. This is lush. It's green for anybody who's not knowledgeable in plants.
It's all clover.
It's all clover, but it's green. As an ecologist, this isn't what I want. What clover is good at as a non-native plant, same thing with this vetch, this yellow tick trefoil, which is this yellow one or yellow lotus. It's really good at fixing nitrogen. So we have this horrible soil that got brought in. I mean, I'm like, they could try it a little harder. Horrible soil that's brought in. It does help add some nutrients to the soil. However, I don't want my meadow to look like this. I want it to be full of lush, beautiful New England native plants. So in spring, I'm gonna mow this. So 2023, I'm panicking because of all these naturalized and non-native plants. I mow all of that, and then summer 2023, starting to look a little different. So this picture over here is that big open, horrible awfulness you saw earlier, that big dirt pile. These are some other areas of these meadows, and I'm starting to see some native plants come up, which is great.
And this is not reseeded, it's from what was
Nope.
there, but you got rid of the other stuff at home.
Yep. So this is what was there 2 years after seeding. So I saw no native plants for the first 2 years. All I saw was all that stuff you saw. But specific mowing intervals, waiting for the rain in some senses, because that's irrigating 10 acres is expensive even for a botanic garden. But being patient, targeting those non-native species at the right interval. The right interval for most of those is always going to be when it's flowering, peak exhaustion for that plant. And then trying to shift the timing to when a lot of our native plants come up. So one of the ways that invasives are problematic is they displace native plants because they can grow earlier than our native plants. So something like a meadow, a lot of the stuff in here is late season. So we call them our warm season grasses, for example, things like little blue stem, big blue stem. They're really not starting to do anything until late July, August. But a lot of these non-native plants, April, that clover is already flowering. So it can get out ahead of the game. And that's kind of one of the main problems they have when it comes to displacing native plants. Not only taking up the space, but being able to do it so much earlier. So the way that we can manage that is by offsetting that timeline coming in and cutting it, and then giving our native plants a chance to compete with that at their time. So if I mow this meadow June 1st or May 15th, right as our native plants are about to come up, I've cut everything flush and they can start growing at their peak time, and then they have to then compete with those non-natives. Yep.
So there's a trend now for no more May.
Oh,
So.
I'd love to talk about that.
No, thank you.
I wouldn't have brought that up if you hadn't said it. No Mo May is it's in the right place thought wise. It is completely incorrect as far as like
Oh,
proper.
that's what I'm gathering from.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what we talk about in the ecological landscape industry is something more. That term was coined by somebody who wasn't an ecologist. So the right term is really slow mo May. So no mo May kind of came about because there are these flowers that are blooming that are good for pollinators.
Right.
The flowers aren't the ones we want. Right. They're the non-native
Yeah,
ones.
irons and those closer.
And there are species that can use those, but we would rather have the ones that those pollinators evolved be coming up. So slow mo May is really the better thing. Yeah, you can stop mowing your yard, but what I'd rather see, mow it in April, mow it May 1st, then let it come up, and then the right stuff is going to be coming up. But unfortunately, that's another one of those things that kind of took off and run in the media, and we're kind of like, we don't want to say it's bad, but it's not quite right.
No.
But yeah, so that is something I run into every time I give a meadow talk. It's like, but wait a minute, no mo May, because they'd see me out there in the garden talking about ecology and cutting the grass. So
Well, but that's good to know. Somebody.
Absolutely.
Encouraged.
Yep.
this rather than-
I also did read that it was started by someone in like Minnesota or Wisconsin where there are different zones, and for us, if our stuff is coming up earlier, then. Yeah, like, it's also a timing thing with where it was started,
timing is
what I've read.
the hardest thing when I teach about this. We're talking about invasive plants here. I'm going to try not to turn it into a meadow talk, even though I love it. When we're talking about meadows, it is so hard to say just mow this time because it's very season dependent within a couple weeks. So 1 year I do it this, 1 year I do it that, based on observation, which you can only do if you have a background, right? So some of those things like that are national, even stateside, are difficult to uphold. I could tell you mow in May, but that might be wrong depending on your specific circumstance. So, but I'll give some resources at the end of the presentation of some other organizations outside of us that I've worked with a lot that do a lot of teaching specific to our region. And that's where I would look to when you start making some transitions. Some of them will talk about timing specifically to say, we're doing this right now, and you can kind of follow that versus something like no mo May. But anyway, so this is summer 2023. 2 to 3 years. There were different parts were seeded different times. Either way, so I haven't seen any of this until this year. Finally, this summer comes up, and the whole staff is like, "Oh my God, you did it!" Like I didn't do. I just all I did was mow, and the plants did everything else. So summer 2024. Again, no other treatment other than mowing. There is not any invasives in there other than right by the road, little bit of Queen Anne's lace. And again, that one's naturalized, not invasive.
Mm.
All of this, Joe Pye, our false sunflower, I can't even remember what's in there. A bunch of asters, but either way, you get the point. This was bare soil, just like everything else 4 years ago. The only thing I had to do was change my timing. Here's that meadow 3 years later, from bare soil to a fully established grassland. Those are all native grasses. There are little spits in certain areas where there are things like mugwort, spotted knapweed coming up. Just specific mowing timing. So 10 acres, just me and one other staff person. We can get to that. So don't panic about your space in your yard. It's really about learning timing and knowledge of the plants, and you can get to this point. We will talk about pesticide later. This project specifically, because I was fortunate enough, as opposed to like a lot of land trusts, to have the time to dedicate to focusing on doing this without it. But we're going to talk about some ways to do it with it too. So, like I said, meadows are disturbance adapted. Invasives love disturbance, but in order to have these types of habitat, you have to disturb it. Mowing. And for us here at Norcross, we've had the opportunity to do really what meadows want most, which is burning, which is a little bit more effective than mowing as far as suppressing some of those non-natives. So when people talk about mowing, a lot of people think that fall is the right time to mow. You can do it. Fall is kind of the worst time to mow when it comes to preserving pollinator habitat. A lot of our native pollinators, a lot of our Lepidoptera are using those woody, pithy stems in the meadow. So if we cut all that, we lose all that habitat. Now, there's going to be times when you come to my next meadow talk, where I'll talk about where you will do it. But really the best time, so like I said, that winter habitat. Same thing, birds too. A lot of people mow their meadow in fall, or they mow their yard in fall, and all that great seed that birds are going to be using over the winter is gone. Yep.
Mm.
I'm sorry, one more question about that.
Yep.
So we have a field behind my house.
Yep.
And, the guy that we hire to mow it wants to mow it in the spring, but the red-winged blackbirds are already there. So like, there's this dance that you do with,
Mhm.
like, they're already nesting, they're ground nesting.
1 second. Give me
Okay.
2 slides.
Thank you.
I love that
Okay.
question. I
Good.
love that
Okay.
question though. But
Thank
we'll
you.
talk about that. Because again, so the reality with meadow management, the reality with all these projects, invasive species management, all of it is goal based. So I could talk about what my goal is. I'm a botanist. My goal is plants. There's all these other factors, right? I've talked to people that no, you have to mow in the spring because of insect habitat. Then I've talked to other people that are like, no, what are you doing? You have to mow in the winter for turtle habitat. Like it really is, you could do this infinitely, right? But either way, it has to get disturbed for that to be that habitat type. Otherwise, it just reforests, right? So you kind of got to pick your battles. When we're talking about mowing, specifically in spring, you don't have to mow everything all at once. So not everything needs to get mowed all the time. If you look at a lot of the meadows here at Norcross, some of those haven't been mowed in 5 years. They're gonna get mowed. They need to be mowed or they need to be burned, but they don't need to be mowed until the species that I'm looking to get rid of are starting to cause a problem. It doesn't need to get mowed until the trees that are that later stage of succession of reforestation are starting to show up. I'm only gonna mow to offset that calendar and get back to the point where those species I'm interested in targeting are going to show up. So these are one of my favorite things, are these wildlife islands. So this is actually before that construction. This is what that meadow looked like. It was pretty much mown as it's a septic field, which is not very glamorous, but it was mowed as a septic field. They just mowed the snot out of it in the fall, same way you would do with DOT, and nothing was really there. So I had to do a lot of offset. The way I would try to keep habitat was with these little islands. Now, these ones are a little small, but in context, so I'm mowing this in the fall. There's a woodcock in there. There's some common milkweed I wanted to keep there. There's some goldenrod I wanted to keep there. So I'm leaving these pockets. So I have to disturb the other parts because the rest of this was all full bittersweet. But I can leave these pockets of what I would call good or beneficial habitat. Same thing with the spring. Spring is turkey nesting, spring is grouse nesting. You have all this stuff that is a problem if you're mowing a meadow in the spring. So I'm not going to mow all of it. I'm going to leave these pockets where the things that I'm looking to preserve can stay. And if there's invasives in there, I'll think about it a different way as far as managing it. But everything else that's not a problem, I'm going to mow. We're going to see some of that in the habitat orchard when we go for a walk a little bit later. I did some spring mowing and I'll talk about how I chose those areas essentially. But yeah, for fall, mowing as high as possible, keeping as many pockets as possible, only mow or manage what you need to manage, right? We don't need to manage everything. A lot of times people who have a meadow at home, they're like, I got to mow all of it. All of it's got to get cut all the time because it's a meadow, but only if the stuff you don't want is there, right? Otherwise, why would I cut it, right? If there's a bunch of blueberry, there's a bunch of little blue stem, I don't need to cut it. It's doing fine on its own. So here's that example. So this you can't quite see, but there was a wildlife island down here that was about this size. 3 years of changing that milkweed mowing pattern, saving those wildlife islands. This went from this 10 by 10 patch. Now it's about an acre of milkweed. So just by changing the timing that I was coming in there. So spring, ideal way to combat invasives, but you have other problems like I just talked about that you have to manage. The biggest thing I try to do is exhaust those early season things. So our turf grasses, our orchard grasses, the stuff that we're mowing for hay, early season grasses. So non-native European grasses grow before our native grasses. So when I'm mowing in the spring, I'm trying to mow all those non-native grasses and invasives until we get to the point that our natives are starting to pop up, usually around June into July. Sometimes, depending on the area, I'll even mow into July because I'm going to be cutting my native plants, but still, we're later in the season. They're going to be growing a lot better than the stuff that grows early in the cool season. So, and like I said, picking spots. So I have a massive meadow here. This one is somewhere around 10 acres as well. This is spring. This whole section had some invasives I didn't want. This is all goldenrod and Joe Pye. What am I going to cut it for? Right. So, but a lot of people end up creating more problems because you cut everything and then some of those invasives can come in when you already had really good native plant competition right there. So this is more of a meadow talk part, but like it is low maintenance, but not no maintenance is something I always talk about. So it's a little different. So it's less maintenance than mowing a lawn all the time, but there's still work that goes into it. There's timing, there's specific decisions you need to make. So there is still a lot of work that comes to it. So targeted management is what we're going to talk about. So I talked about mowing, but there's other instances where say that goldenrod field is all beautiful goldenrod, but there's a couple plants I don't want. I'm not going to mow the whole meadow because there's a couple plants I don't want, right? I can go in there in that 10 acres, and if there's 100 plants I don't want, why would I not just go in and cut those specifically and leave everything else? Is anybody familiar with this plant?
Looks like dill.
Close.
It's like a fennel. Or a fennel.
Close. So wild parsnip. So wild parsnip. Parsnip. This is when you are a manager and you have interns and you manage meadows. This is about the scariest thing I can find out in a meadow to some degree, especially when you're sending a bunch of interns out there with string trimmers. So wild parsnip is pretty problematic. Has anybody heard about giant hogweed before? So giant hogweed has the oil that gets on your skin. Yep, the oil gets on your skin. A lot of people think it's just a rash from the oil. It actually causes photosensitivity. So you get the oil on you, it makes you super sensitive to light. When you get some of those burns, some of those scars can stay for years. So same thing with this plant. The oil causes photosensitivity. Yep, and this is one that I'm starting to see. Like I see it all over Connecticut, all over New York, because of the mowing intervals that they use mowing highways. It's hard for them to manage for native habitat when they need to keep the roads visible. But because of the timing that they have to do, this plant loves it. So you'll see this all the time driving down the highway. You'll see this row of yellow, and that's what this is. So another non-native, but one that can be really caustic to people that we need to manage. So some of these super aggressive things, it's best to manage super targeted before it starts to get out of hand. But it can be difficult to manage because of some of the chemical properties of some of these plants. That's why it's super important to start with your invasive ID first. And before you start slinging a string trimmer or brush blade, learning everything that's out there. So I have to go out into a lot of these spaces and find these first before I send people out there. And I need to teach the crap out of them before they go out there because they're going to be slinging around in there hitting stuff like this. So giant hogweed's another one that's coming. It's coming. So it's ripping up Rhode Island. It'll be here soon. That one at least is very easy to ID. So
I heard there's some in Broomfield.
yep. So probably there's probably isolated populations that move to where it's super problematic. Like if you go to a lot of the beaches in Rhode Island, it's some of those coastal dunes it's moving in pretty heavily. It's just a hard one to manage once it starts going. But when we talk about targeted, one of the ways you can do it is, so say we're talking about woodies. Say you've got 10 buckthorn in your yard you want to get rid of. If you cut it, it will slow it down, but that root system's still there. So if you wanted to mechanically remove it and you're not fortunate enough to have a giant backhoe, which is ideal, there's tools like this, like a weed wrench. These work awesome. Every land trust in TerraCore I know has one of these. It just grabs onto the stem. You just leverage that thing over and it pops the whole thing out with the roots. There's these couple of different brands, Weed Wrench, Polar Bear, Uprooter. Now, if I was to go use that for 8,000 acres, I'd make it about an hour. And but for small populations, for small properties, this is awesome because then you're removing the whole thing, right? There are other problems. We would call this hand pulling when we talk about management strategies. There are problems with hand pulling because, yeah, I'm going to pull out this one glossy buckthorn. But if that plant's been there 15 years and all that seed is right here, what's going to happen when I rip all that soil up? So that being said, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. So now the big plant's gone, and then every year I just need to make sure I'm going out there to get all those small plants, right? Any type of invasive treatment, there is never a one and done. You could spray a bunch of pesticide. It's not a one and done. It's 5 years of going out there and making sure you get rid of it. But so that is a good way for single individuals. What usually happens for these large scale operations when you have 8,000 acres, pesticide is kind of what needs to be used. Some of these species you really can't manage any other mechanical way. So good example is something like Japanese knotweed. You look at its prevalence, there's not a really effective way, no matter how hard we try or how much we want to manage that mechanically. So targeted chemical treatment is the way to do it. So same thing with any of the work that we have coming up with Norcross as far as some of our invasive species management. We're going to be using pesticide. There's a whole process, there's permits, but it's incredibly targeted. So one of the things that pesticides kind of get, I would say, a bad rap, which they should get a bad rap for, is when people are doing kind of broad spectrum herbicide application. They're just going out and spraying a whole bunch and getting that everywhere. Whereas targeted is more you're coming in that specific plant. I'm targeting that plant, and then I could have a meadow where there's, say, 10 of those wild parsnips, and the only thing that's getting pesticide on it is the wild parsnips, right? So for large scale properties and for certain species, this is kind of what you need to do, is these targeted herbicide applications. So we use things like this, these little Smucker sponges. So there's a concentration of a systemic herbicide in there. I come in there with my little sponge, and the only thing I'm touching is the plants I don't want. Even with treatment, you're going to have to do repeated treatments until that population is done. Say something like, so Vinica brook restoration, some of the areas that I'm treating are Phragmites. We have some pretty large wetlands that Phragmites is one that can move down that water corridor really easily. So if all of those upstream sections of Vinica brook, if we don't come in there and manage that Phragmites, it could float downstream. So we're going to be managing some of those with some targeted herbicide from a company we're working with. That's going to probably be 3-4 years of treatment on those. So
That's when I remember that Leslie used to take out the crew and go around trying to get rid of that.
Yeah. That's a tough one. And it spreads really quickly.
Yeah, takes over metal and stuff like that. It likes wetland and the root system is so thick.
It is And there's no mechanical way to manage it. And on top of that, so say we talk about in the wetland context. So say we're not a homeowner, say we're a Norcross and we need to manage in a wetland. You're still going to need a permit. You're going to be disturbing wetland soils. And as far as the wetland side of it, digging all that Phragmites out is way worse than targeted treatment pesticide. So it can be super difficult, but that's kind of the way things need to go. This is not to overwhelm you, and don't worry about this picture because I'm going to talk about a resource, but this is something I have to use. Every day I come in and I have my list that I've made of what species, what time, when it's doing what, because there is specific timing for pesticide applications that I need to be following as far as the most effective. So, but there are very specific treatment windows generally in the fall for a lot of our stuff. Some of them are early. One of the ones I've been dealing with in the last couple months, cypress spurge, swallowwort, starting to get pretty bad in this area too. And that's another super difficult one that's really bad for monarchs. But was that a overwhelmed sigh? Because I have
Yeah.
that too. Yeah.
I'm dealing with it right now.
Yeah.
Of Town Meadow.
Oh, other thing I didn't talk about. So, I get this a lot from land trusts. I've volunteered a lot with land trusts. I volunteered a lot with watershed associations. A lot of these groups are grant funded, and grant funding can be used for herbicide treatment, which is great. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually take, as the grant pays for 1 year. You do an herbicide treatment for 1 year, and then in 5 years, when you haven't done any follow-up, it's kind of useless to some degree. So I actually, as awful as it sounds, some of the watershed associations I've talked to, they're taking that grant money and using it somewhere else and finding a way to budget for treatment versus using that grant money. Because I wouldn't call it the same as throwing that money away. But if you're only going to do a year and you know you can only do a year, why would you? It's just going to come back, right? If you can't do follow-up treatments. So, and that's kind of the way that grant cycle works. We run into the same exact thing here. The other thing is they want you to treat in June, which doesn't work. So, it is difficult for a lot of those organizations that don't have self-funding to do large projects. And yeah, not to make it even more depressing, but so woody material, cut and paint, cut and paint, cut and paint. Why am I going to come in and just spray all over the tree when I can just come in and cut the stem? So this is what we're doing for a lot of stuff. Autumn olive, Russian olive, bittersweet, barberry, a lot of these woody deep root system plants. We use a tool like this. This is called a buckthorn blaster. Put your pesticide in there. You've got this pretty little sponge tip. Cut it. Dab that right over it. You can do the same thing. It's called cut and paint because it used to be you could do it with a little mason jar and a paintbrush. This is just contained and way easier, so you don't spill it in the truck while you're driving around.
It was like that, and Leslie would go around cutting plants down and put a ribbon on so we come back
Yep.
and paint it with a paintbrush.
Awesome. And that's where that term comes from. It's just this makes it cleaner, a little bit cleaner. Great tool. But we're cutting it. We're in the fall. The plants are pulling nutrients down to their root system. You're putting that systemic herbicide on there, and it's pulling that in there and killing that root system. So that's just how you take the tips off.
Oh.
So you have these little sponge tips.
Yeah.
So that tool just lets you pop that tip off when you got to change it out.
Find such a thing.
NISMA, so North American Invasive Species Management Association, which is just a ridiculous name, but I think they're $10, something like that. You can buy a bunch of tips if you're switching in between products. Usually you use something that's got a foaming surfactant or at least a dyed surfactant so you can see what you've treated. The foaming is good because it helps it stay on top of the cut stem. But this is my fall right there. So usually, so we would probably be using glyphosate. So triclopyr is selective for herbaceous material and not grasses. So triclopyr is more like if I needed to go into a meadow and spray in an open grassy area, I could be a little bit less targeted with that because it only is going to affect those forbs. But for a lot of cut and paint, you're talking glyphosate for the most part. And for us here, I'm not licensed for restricted use. Everything I'm doing in my license and what I've been doing the last 10 years is what we call general use. So commercial, I need a pesticide license. Most homeowners can get access to Roundup and everything. But there are some, don't touch that one. There are some other ones that are becoming less prevalent because of some of the environmental and human health impacts, like 2,4-D is a restricted use pesticide now in Massachusetts. But when you're selecting what you're going to use, just make sure you read the label. A lot of the stuff you're going to get at Home Depot is going to be lower use concentration in your home center stuff. It's going to be a pre-mixed a lot of time concentration. That doesn't necessarily mean it won't work for the same techniques I'm talking about. It just might mean you need to do it more often, as opposed to something like me making a custom mix of a higher concentration. If you ever have questions, contact local cooperative extensions. So does everybody know what a cooperative extension is? So ours is UMass Amherst out here. You call and say, I don't know what I'm doing. Their team there will help you, walk you through what your treatment is. We still call them all the time. I still work with them all the time from the horticulture industry. But if you have questions, that's where to look. They're going to teach you how to use that. And if you're doing commercial, you're going to need an applicator core license at least for general use pesticides commercially. Organic is an option. I won't say it's bad. It is organic. So one of the problems with a lot of these other herbicides is they do have a half-life. They do show up in the soil. That's kind of one of those things when we're talking about is the herbicide versus the invasive species work. It's one of those battles we're going to always have. There is organic. What a lot of people don't realize about organic is, for one, it's not a systemic treatment. It's not changing that plant cycle. It's what we would call a burn down. So you spray it and this kills the top of the plant. I could also just cut it and do the same thing. So you're using an herbicide that's not going to actually be treating that full system. And a lot of times these are, as far as human health impacts, way more dangerous. So they might have less environmental impact, but for example, a warning on a lot of Roundup products might be like a caution. Whereas something like Avenger here, I believe, no, so Avenger here and the premix here is caution. Some of them, like some of the citric acid and stuff like that, shows up as a danger warning. So you have a little bit more risk using it, even though it's organic, because of how concentrated it is to be effective. And at the end of the day, it's not doing a full system treatment. So is this something I'm going to choose? Sometimes, not that often. But treating weeds in a patio, maybe. But I'm not necessarily going to use that for invasive species management. So big scale, there's my multiflora rose that's up into the canopy over here. So I don't think a lot of homeowners are going to be pulling out invasives on this scale. This is a 3-4 acre restoration of a wildlife garden I was working on. We have bittersweet and multifloral, as you can see, that's way up into the canopy. And same thing with Hovey Road. I can't even think about using herbicide or treatment until I get to a baseline first, right? So using heavy equipment is kind of what it's going to be for a land trust. That could be hiring a contractor. That could be hiring a pesticide contractor that they get paid to do that. The contractor we use pretty often, I could get quoted for a job like this, but they're going to say the first step is they're going to mow it 1 year and then come back the next year when everything's short and then treat it. So anytime you have an infestation that's at this point, either way, you're going to need to get to a starting point. So for me here, yanking all this out, brush hogging the crap out of it, and then treating the stuff that came up afterwards. And I know a lot of land trusts that have done similar things, pulling bittersweet out of trees with excavators, getting everything cut. And then when all that stuff starts to reflush, is now tired, it doesn't have all those resources, then coming in and treating it. When I was talking about not using pesticides in some of those meadows, again, this is that same one with all those things I didn't want. This is kind of like, this was my bread and butter. So brush blade, string trimmer, cut it at the right time, cut. So targeted species, targeted timing, targeted species with a brush blade. You got to be there doing it often, all the time. But what this does, at least, it might not fully get rid of those species that are in there, but it'll keep them from making seed every time. So what my goal is here is to get to a static point. So no new invasion, at least from those individuals. I can't control the birds. I could, but I don't want to, that are bringing the stuff in. But we're keeping stasis. So say here at Norcross, I have an area that I'm going to manage at some point. I'm gonna mow, I'm gonna mow, and mow, and it'll keep it in what I would call a holding pattern until I can come in and treat. I might not have funding or time to do treatment, but I can keep it from growing and growing and growing by at least keeping it static. So this is kind of my favorite way to do it. When we were managing that meadow I showed in those earlier pictures, it was this and the mower, and that's the only thing you saw out there to get to that point. So, and there it is, another angle in the fall. You can hand pull, but like I said, you're going to be disturbing soil. So that's just something you need to accommodate for when you're doing it. And you can use pesticides, but if you're going to do it as targeted as possible, avoid overspray. There's a lot of rules when it comes to water, so make sure you're doing your research when it comes to buffer zones, wetland areas, as far as doing invasive species treatment, because you might need a permit if you're doing that. And it's the same thing technically if I wanted to go pull purple loosestrife out of the ditch in my yard, you need a wetland permit. So that's just the way that those wetlands are managed. It can be difficult even if you're not using any herbicide. And in some cases, like I was saying earlier, they might rather I use an herbicide than go in there and dig stuff out. But I definitely didn't dig that purple loosestrife out of a meadow in a wetland or anything, but it wasn't. It was a detention basin, but that was dry. So here's some great resources. So Mass Audubon has an awesome list of invasive plants in Massachusetts. And then they have a whole protocol, and like once you have those plants, what they would suggest for treatment times. Another great company located near Worcester, I think, is this company Green Abundance by Design. My treatment windows were inspired by the work that they do because they've done a really great job. They're a newer company, but they've done a really great job talking about the type of work they do, the timing they're doing, and why they're doing it. So their social media, their website is great. For anybody that's on their local conservation commission, the MACC, Association of Conservation Commissioners, they have a great webpage that has a whole bunch of different resources that you can kind of reference when it comes to invasive species. And then the Natural Resource Commission also has a little outdated now, 2012, but is a robust document on effective management of invasives that talks about timing. And it's pretty similar. It doesn't include some of the more novel ones, but as far as the methodology, hasn't really changed that much. Yeah. And then after this, we'll go for a little walk and talk about some of that stuff. Does anybody have any questions about all that I just rambled about?
You
What
get your
was
work
that?
cut out.
What was that brush thing you talked about? A brush wand?
Up toward.
No, what you
The
use.
weed
This guy?
Not the weed wrench. I know what a weed wrench is
Yeah,
like that.
that?
But it was something else. You said a brush, some brush cutter thing.
Oh, brush blade.
Blade.
Yep, yep.
What is that?
So it's kind of like a general term. A brush blade is what I would just call it's like a string trimmer that has a blade on it.
So you could cut.
Yep.
The
It looks like a saw blade.
barberry.
Yep.
And not get all.
Yep.
Pricked and things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, versus using a string trimmer. So for a lot of the woody stuff, that's kind of the way to go. A lot of times you can put a blade on a lot of bigger string trimmers, but a lot of these ones have what's called a bike handle and a harness. Because
Yeah.
if I send my staff out there for 4 hours
Yeah.
with a regular string trimmer, it's tough if you don't have a harness and everything holding in. But like I said, that is everything is starting with this in that scale. Norcross, we've got a little bit bigger space, but some of the meadows here, I'm going to come in and here's a good example. So Little Bluestem Meadow, which is over by our museum building, that hasn't been mowed in 5 years, I think. And there are 4 years. There's no invasives in there. The only thing that's in there is white pine, which is starting to grow, which I'm not going to mow the whole meadow just because there's white pine. We can go out there with that brush blade, cut that white pine, take it out of there, and I can leave it alone for another 4 years versus mowing the whole thing. So it lets you be super selective once you've kind of learned what's in there.
Did you say this is available online?
So yep,
Your,
yep.
presentation?
I think Kara's going to share it.
Oh, awesome.
There were seminars are going to be radio or not, so you can like go back and there like take notes. For sure.
Thank you.
Yep. I love questions. They're my favorite part. So Lois.
About garlic, let's do it.
So garlic mustard, specifically